Leaving you was the best decision I ever made. Derek Mercer said it with a smile and a champagne flute in his hand, standing 3 feet from me beneath a white wedding tent in Charlottesville, while my cousin's string quartet drifted through at last, like the universe had a mean sense of timing. There were 120 people under that tent, maybe more if you counted the catering staff moving between tables with silver trays of crab cakes and champagne coups. My mother was seated 2 chairs to my left. My cousin Celia's church friends were at table 6. Derek's mother was 20 feet away in a blue silk jacket, pretending not to notice her younger son humiliating his ex-wife at a family wedding. I didn't answer him. I just looked at his face and thought, for one strange detached second, that he had aged exactly the way bitterness ages a man who mistakes charm for character. The corners of his mouth still knew how to lift on cue. His tie was expensive. His cufflinks caught the amber light strung through the tent. But there was a grayness around his eyes that hadn't been there when I was 42 and foolish enough to think being loved and being safe were close cousins. Then a little girl in a pale yellow dress barreled across the dance floor, wrapped both arms around my knees, and pressed her cheek to my skirt. "I love you, Mommy." The room went so quiet I could hear the clink of a fork against china at the head table. Behind me, the tent flap opened. Men's dress shoes crossed the wood flooring. I didn't have to turn around to know who had walked in. I knew the cadence of his step by then, the measured pace of a man who had spent half his life entering rooms where people either lied for a living or told the truth because they had no choice left. That was the moment Derek Mercer learned that 5 years is a long time to underestimate a woman you once mistook for manageable. My name is Evelyn Mercer, Evie to the people who have earned it. I was 47 years old that night at my cousin's wedding, a senior probate paralegal in Richmond, Virginia, and the mother of a 4-year-old girl I had not given birth to, but loved with the ferocity of something heaven had placed in my hands after taking a knife to the rest of my life. This is the story of the night my husband betrayed me with my best friend, and of the 5 years I spent learning that silence is not surrender, grief is not weakness, and leaving with your dignity intact can be the first move in a reckoning no one sees coming. 5 years earlier, on my 42nd birthday, I left work at 4:30 because my husband had texted me 3 times before lunch to make sure I'd be home by 6 o'clock. "Don't be late, birthday girl, I've got a surprise." I should tell you now that Derek was never a man who loved surprises for other people. He liked control. He liked reveal. He liked the performance of generosity, the part where people looked at him and thought, what a thoughtful husband. What a polished man. What a life they must have together. If Derek bought you flowers, he wanted you to photograph them. If he reserved a table at a restaurant, he wanted the hostess to recognize his name. If he gave me earrings for my birthday, he wanted to be thanked in a way that could be overheard. At 42, I knew this about him and had already begun filing it under truths I didn't say out loud. I worked in a probate and estate litigation firm on East Main Street, then in a brick building with narrow windows and an elevator that complained on every floor. My days were spent inside other people's endings. Wills, trusts, family land fights, bitter daughters, bewildered widowers, handwritten codicils found in desk drawers after funerals. I was good at the work because I understood that the ugliest things people do often happen in rooms with nice lamps and framed wedding photos. Greed does not arrive wearing a sign. It arrives with a casserole or a husband who says he made dinner reservations for your birthday. That afternoon, I left the office with a lemon cake from the bakery downstairs because my assistant Nina insisted no woman should go home on her birthday empty-handed, even if her husband claimed to have something planned. I balanced the white bakery box on the passenger seat of my Lexus and drove through Richmond traffic with the radio low and the windows cracked enough to let in the smell of wet pavement. It had rained at noon, one of those brief Virginia spring showers that leaves the sidewalk steaming and the magnolia blossoms stuck to the curb like dropped silk. Derek had been odd for months by then, though odd is the kindest word I can use for a man who has already begun arranging his life around lies. He was in wealth management at the time, or rather, he liked to say he was in wealth management. What Derek actually did shifted every 6 months depending on what kind of business card he'd ordered most recently. Investment advisory, legacy planning, boutique financial consulting. He wore navy suits, shook the right hands, and spoke in polished paragraphs about portfolio strategy while forgetting to pay the gas bill. He was the sort of man who knew the language of money better than he knew the discipline required to keep any. Still, for most of our marriage, I had mistaken his confidence for confidence. I'd also mistaken my best friend's loyalty for love. Vanessa Cole had been in my life for 15 years by then. We met when I was 27 and still figuring out how to look older than my face in legal offices, where every senior attorney called women under 30 girls, no matter how many estates they were quietly holding together. Vanessa was funny in a bright, reckless way that made rooms feel less formal. She had thick dark hair, quick hands, and a habit of finishing my sentences as if we shared a bloodstream. She worked in private trust administration at a regional bank and knew more about old Virginia money than anyone I'd ever met who hadn't inherited any. We had brunch every other Sunday. She knew what kind of tea my mother drank when she had a migraine. She had a key to my house. She had stood next to me in our kitchen and helped frost Derek's 40th birthday cake while telling me I was the only person who really knew her. If you'd asked me at 42 who would never betray me, I would have given you 2 names without hesitation. By the time I pulled into our driveway that evening, the house looked exactly as it should have. The porch lights were on. The hydrangeas along the front walk were beginning to leaf out. Derek's Mercedes was in the drive. Through the kitchen windows, I could see warm light and the faint flicker of candles. For one stupid second, I smiled. I carried the lemon cake in one hand and my laptop bag in the other, nudged the front door shut with my hip, and called out, "Derek?" No answer. I set the cake box on the foyer table beside the mail and listened. Music was playing somewhere upstairs, something soft and old-fashioned. Nat King Cole, maybe too low to make out clearly. I smelled seared steak, butter, and the sweet, expensive perfume Vanessa wore when she wanted to feel invincible. I stood very still. People talk about intuition as if it arrives like thunder. Mine never has. Mine is quieter than that. It's the small internal shift that happens when the room no longer makes sense, and some disciplined part of your mind begins taking inventory before your heart can start lying to you. Vanessa's perfume. At 6 o'clock in my house. I climbed the stairs without calling out again. I remember noticing absurd things. The second stair still creaked on the left side. The hallway lamp needed a new bulb. Someone had left Derek's loafers kicked halfway under the bench outside our bedroom. The bedroom door was open 3 inches. Light spilled through the gap. I pushed it wider with my fingertips. Vanessa was in my bed, wearing my husband's white dress shirt and nothing else. Derek was shirtless, sitting against the headboard with one hand on her thigh and the expression of a man who had been caught in the middle of something he had already decided to justify. No one screamed. No one lunged. No one threw a lamp. Vanessa's face went white first. Derek said my name the way people say wait right before they lie. Evie. I looked at the bed. Then I looked at the chair by the window where Vanessa's black dress was draped neatly over the arm. My gold bracelet, the one my mother gave me for my 40th birthday, was looped around the strap of her purse like she'd taken it off absent-mindedly after dinner. Then I saw the laptop. It was open on Derek's side of the bed, screen still awake, a document glowing in the dim room. At first, all I registered was the familiar formatting of trust paperwork, distribution columns, account notes, signatures. Then my eyes caught the header. Helen Mercer Family Trust. Helen Mercer was Derek's mother, and beneath the account summary was a transfer notation that made the air in my lungs go cold. I stepped past the bed before either of them could stop me and lifted the laptop with both hands. Derek moved then, too late. Evie, don't. I held up one hand without looking at him. Don't speak. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded flatter, cleaner. Vanessa pulled the sheet to her chest. This isn't what it looks like. I turned to her then, and if I live to be 90, I will never forget the nerve it took for her to say that while sitting naked in my bed with my husband and my bracelet on her purse and his family's trust account open on his computer. No, I said, it's worse. The room went silent except for the low hum of the bedside lamp. I looked back at the screen. A transfer had been flagged and then manually reversed. There were initials in the note field that weren't Derek's and weren't Helen's. There was a date from 3 weeks earlier. There was a reference to a sub-account I knew Helen had established for charitable distributions after Derek's father died. And there, in the lower corner, was the watermark of the trust office where Vanessa worked. I didn't need more than 10 seconds to understand the shape of the thing. Not the whole story, not yet. But enough. My husband was sleeping with my best friend. My best friend had access to his mother's trust paperwork. And both of them were sitting in my bedroom with evidence of something financial open between them on my birthday. Like they'd gotten careless enough to believe I would never be the woman who walked in before dessert. I closed the laptop. I picked up Vanessa's dress from the chair and dropped it at her feet. "Get dressed," I said. Then I looked at Derek. "By the time I come back for the rest of my things, I want every password to every joint account written down and left on the kitchen counter. If $1 moves tonight, I will know." He stared at me as if he'd never heard me speak before. The truth was, maybe he hadn't. I walked out of the bedroom carrying his laptop, my car keys, and the lemon cake I had brought home for my own birthday. By midnight, I knew my marriage was over. By 1 o'clock in the morning, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with the laptop open between us and a legal pad under my hand, I knew the affair was the smallest part of what they had done. My mother's kitchen had always been the room where facts sounded less frightening. It wasn't because the room was soft. Marion Holt was not a soft woman. She was a retired middle school principal with silver hair, a spine like a ruler, and a habit of listening to bad news with her hands folded so neatly in her lap you could mistake her calm for indifference if you didn't know better. But that kitchen on Grove Avenue had held every hard thing that had ever happened to me. My father's funeral casseroles, my first college rejection, the phone call telling us my appendix had burst at 23, the night Derek proposed, the morning I told her I thought I might be making a mistake, and then married him anyway 6 months later. It was where I had learned that a woman could sit upright in the face of humiliation and still keep her heart from turning theatrical. At 1 o'clock in the morning on my 42nd birthday, I sat at that kitchen table in my work skirt and heels with Derek's laptop open in front of me and my mother heating water for tea I had no intention of drinking. She set the kettle down, looked once at my face, then at the screen, and asked the only useful question. "What did you see besides the obvious?" That was why I went to her instead of a friend. A friend might have said, "Oh my God, Evie," or "How could they?" or "Do you want me to come over and key his car?" My mother had no patience for reaction that wasted energy before the facts had been arranged. I turned the laptop toward her and pointed to the transfer log. "This is Helen's charitable sub-account. Derek shouldn't have access to it, not directly. And Vanessa definitely shouldn't have anything from the trust office on his personal computer." My mother adjusted her reading glasses. "What am I looking at?" "A reversal entry. Something moved out and then back in. Maybe because someone got nervous. Maybe because someone realized the paper trail was too obvious." I leaned closer to the screen. "See that notation? It references an interim disbursement approval. Helen would never authorize one without copying Graham. She doesn't even order mulch for her backyard without copying Graham." My mother nodded once. She knew Derek's family the way Richmond women know one another's histories without ever admitting how much they know. She had met Helen Mercer at charity luncheons and church fundraisers. She knew Graham Mercer by reputation. The older brother, the serious one, the attorney with the careful eyes and the clean record. She knew Derek the way mothers know sons-in-law they've never fully trusted, through the tiny inventory of things that don't add up over years. Late tax payments, vague explanations, the kind of charm that performs itself too hard. "Can you prove what this means?" she asked. "Not tonight." "Can you prove what it might mean?" That made me look up. My mother was standing at the counter, one hand resting beside the kettle, still in the blue cotton robe she wore after 9 o'clock every night, regardless of weather or company. There was no pity in her face, no panic. Just that same old-school principal expectation that if I was bringing a problem into the room, I had better be prepared to think my way through it. "Yes," I said, "I think I can." She gave a short nod. "Then sit there and think. I'll make tea anyway." I didn't sleep that night. I made a legal pad list instead. I have spent 20 years around probate files, trust disputes, guardianship hearings, and the strange greed that rises in families after someone dies. If you work long enough in estate law, you stop believing betrayal arrives with fireworks. Most of the time it arrives by incremental trespass. A nephew who borrows a checkbook. A daughter who persuades a father with dementia to sign a deed. A brother who says he's only helping with the paperwork. The first rule of surviving those cases is simple. Do not trust your memory alone. Write everything down before shame or fatigue starts rearranging it into something easier to bear. So, at 1:30 in the morning on my birthday, while my marriage lay in a smoking heap 15 minutes away in the fan, I began a list on one of my mother's yellow legal pads. What I knew for certain, Derek and Vanessa were having an affair. Vanessa's trust office watermark appeared on a Mercer family trust document open on Derek's personal laptop. The transfer notation referenced a charitable sub-account controlled by Helen Mercer. The entry had been reversed. The date on the notation was 3 weeks old. The laptop had been opened in my bedroom while my husband and my best friend were in my bed. That was the first page. The second page was uglier, because it required me to stop pretending the last year had been normal. Derek had been asking more questions about family trust structures lately, always in that casual tone people use when they want to make curiosity sound harmless. How do successor trustees work again? Can a beneficiary request a temporary distribution if the primary trustee is elderly? If a charitable fund sits inside a larger trust, who signs off on changes? At the time, I'd answered the way wives answer questions from husbands who know enough about your job to sound interested. I thought he was making conversation or trying, in his clumsy way, to understand what I did all day. Vanessa had been dropping Helen Mercer's name into conversation more often too, not in a way that raised alarms at the time. More in the way women who work in trust administration talk around confidentiality without technically breaking it. She'd say things like, "Some of these old Richmond families never simplify anything," or, "You'd be amazed how many people think they can use a charitable sub-account as a family slush fund if no one's watching closely." Once, over shrimp and grits at Stella's, she'd laughed and said, "If I ever handled my best friend's in-laws' money, I'd recuse myself immediately." I had laughed too, because it had sounded hypothetical. Now, sitting under my mother's kitchen light with my birthday still technically an hour from over, I understood it had not been hypothetical at all. There had been other things. Derek had begun going to Helen's house to help with paperwork after his father's death, though Helen had always been organized enough to keep every bank statement in color-coded folders. He'd offered to streamline some of her accounts. He'd once complained that Graham was too controlling about the trust and said, with a bitterness I should have paid more attention to, "You'd think he was the only son in the family." Vanessa had canceled brunch twice in 1 month because of late meetings at the bank. Yet one of those evenings Derek had come home smelling like her perfume and saying he'd been with a client from Williamsburg. I remember standing at the stove stirring soup while he loosened his tie and kissed my cheek and thinking, for half a second, "That's Vanessa's perfume." Then I told myself I was tired and suspicious and mean-spirited for even thinking it. Women waste years trying to be fair to people who are busy betraying them. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my mother set a plate of toast in front of me, and I ignored it. I was zooming in on the trust document, trying to read the tiny note field more clearly. Derek had not been careful about his browser history either. Maybe he thought I'd be too shattered by the affair to notice the financial trail. Maybe he'd mistaken heartbreak for incompetence. Either way, when I opened the recent documents folder, there were 3 more files connected to Helen's trust. One was a scanned authorization form with Helen's signature at the bottom. One was a spreadsheet listing sub-account balances. One was an email draft, never sent, addressed to Vanessa's work email with the subject line, "Need this before Graham sees quarterly statement." I sat back so abruptly my chair legs scraped the tile. My mother looked up from rinsing the kettle. "What?" I turned the screen toward her. She read the subject line and pressed her lips together. "Well," she said after a moment, "that answers whether this is just adultery." I laughed then, but it wasn't humor. It was the sound a person makes when the worst thing in the room gets replaced by something even uglier. "No," I said, "it isn't just adultery. We worked until 3:30. By we, I mean I clicked and copied and photographed the screen with my phone while my mother asked questions that kept me from drowning in the emotional part of it. What date was the first transfer? Did the reversal happen before or after Helen's last luncheon? Had Derek ever mentioned charitable distributions at Christmas? Was Vanessa the only trust officer who could have touched those files? Did Graham know anything was wrong? That last question stayed with me. Graham Mercer had always unsettled me a little, not because he was unkind, but because he seemed to see more than he ever said. He was 10 years older than Derek, a corporate attorney, all dark suits and measured speech, and a gaze that lingered just long enough to make you feel he'd noticed every omission in your story. He was not warm in the way Derek was warm. He did not flatter. He did not perform affection. He did not enter a room looking for applause. At our wedding, while Derek worked the crowd like a man campaigning for office, Graham had stood near the back of my mother's garden in a navy suit and watched everything with the expression of someone taking notes for a future he hoped not to need. Over the years, he had never once crossed a line with me, never said anything inappropriate, never meddled in our marriage. But twice in the past 12 months, he had asked me if I was all right. The first time was at Helen's Christmas party, when Derek had disappeared for an hour and Vanessa had shown up late with a bottle of Bordeaux she claimed a client had given her. Graham had found me in the den helping Helen plate desserts and said quietly, "You look tired, Avi." The second time was outside a charity breakfast in February when Derek was late and I was standing in heels on cold brick pretending not to notice. Graham had paused beside me, glanced once at my face, and asked, "Is everything stable at home?" Stable. Not happy, not good, stable. At the time, I'd smiled and said, "Of course." Now I wondered if he had already seen cracks I was still wallpapering over. At 4 o'clock in the morning, my mother went upstairs for a blanket, and I sat alone at the table listening to the refrigerator hum. My phone buzzed twice on the wood beside me. Derek, then Derek again. I turned the screen face down without reading either message. Vanessa texted once, "Please let me explain." I did not answer her either. Instead, I opened the email draft one more time and studied the date. 3 weeks earlier. The same week Helen had called me after lunch to ask, in that apologetic tone older women use when they hate needing help, whether I knew why one of her annual disbursements had been delayed. She'd sounded embarrassed even asking, as if money itself were impolite. I had told her it was probably a clerical lag. I had almost offered to take a look, but Derek had walked into the room then, heard her name, and asked, too casually, what she wanted. He'd been in the room for that call. Of course he had. By dawn, I had a banker's box from my mother's attic filled with printouts, handwritten notes, and 3 changes of clothes. I had no plan for the marriage beyond ending it, but the financial piece was beginning to harden into shape, and with shape came discipline. At 6:15, while the sky over Richmond turned the color of dishwater, and my mother stood at the sink rinsing blueberries, I called in sick to work for the first time in 4 years. Then I called a divorce lawyer named Lydia Shaw, whose name had been passed around among women in my field with the kind of respect usually reserved for surgeons and men who don't miss deadlines. Her receptionist said Lydia could see me at 10 o'clock if it was urgent. "It's urgent," I said. After that, I showered in my childhood bathroom using the same lavender soap my mother had kept on the sink since 1998. I put on navy slacks, a cream blouse, and the pearl studs I wore to court filings when I needed to feel composed. Then I sat on the edge of the guest bed with my phone in my hand and stared at Graham Mercer's name in my contacts for a full minute. I did not call him. Not yet. But as I drove to Lydia Shaw's office with Derek's laptop buckled into the passenger seat beside me and the first legal pad of my new life tucked into my bag, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If Derek had only cheated, I would have divorced him and buried him in silence. But Derek had done something worse. He had touched money that wasn't his, and he had used the woman I loved like a sister to do it. Lydia Shaw's office occupied the second floor of a converted row house on Franklin Street, the kind of old Richmond building that still had narrow staircases, original fireplaces, and windows too tall for modern blinds. Her receptionist wore tortoiseshell glasses and did not smile when I signed in, which I appreciated. Women in crisis are often greeted with the wrong kind of softness. It makes you feel like a patient before you've even decided whether you're sick. Lydia herself was in her late 50s, elegant in a severe way, with silver hair cut to her jaw, and a voice that made every sentence sound pre-approved by a judge. She did not waste the first 10 minutes telling me she was sorry. She did not ask how I was holding up. She asked me to start at the beginning, and because she was the first person in 12 hours who sounded as if she cared more about sequence than sympathy, I trusted her immediately. I told her about coming home to Derek and Vanessa in my bed. I told her about the laptop, the trust documents, the transfer notation, the unsent email draft. I told her about Helen Mercer's delayed charitable disbursement, Derek's recent questions about trust structure, Vanessa's access to the trust office, and the fact that my husband had apparently decided my birthday was as good a night as any to combine adultery with financial misconduct in the same room. Lydia took notes in blue ink on a yellow legal pad. When I was done, she read through her notes once, capped her pen, and said, "Your husband sleeping with your best friend is ugly. Your husband using access to his mother's trust to move money is actionable." The steadiness of this sentence calmed me more than any comfort would have. "What can I prove?" I asked. "Today," she said. "Not enough for criminal charges, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But enough to make people very nervous. Enough to protect you. Enough to put his mother's trust administrator on alert before anything else disappears." I had brought the laptop, my phone, and the first legal pad from my mother's kitchen. Lydia spent the next 90 minutes walking me through what mattered most. Not what hurt most. What mattered most. We printed the email draft. We captured the browser history. We copied the trust files to an external drive she handed me from a locked drawer. We made a list of every shared account Derek and I had, every line of credit, every retirement fund, every insurance policy, every password he might change the minute he realized I was not coming home to cry and negotiate. By noon, my marriage had been translated into a set of legal tasks. There was something clarifying about that. Lydia filed for a temporary financial restraining order before lunch. Not a dramatic one. Nothing that would have officers marching into my house. Just enough to keep either of us from draining joint accounts, moving large sums, or playing games with marital assets while the divorce petition was being prepared. She also drafted a letter to the Mercer Family Trust Administrator, requesting an immediate internal review of recent disbursement activity tied to Helen's charitable subaccount. The letter was careful. It accused no one outright. It simply documented that I had reason to believe confidential trust materials had been improperly accessed and that I was preserving electronic evidence relevant to that concern. "Now," Lydia said, folding the signed letter into a file, "there's the matter of Graham Mercer." I had known his name would come up. Still, hearing it out loud tightened something in my chest. "He's not a beneficiary in the primary sense," I said. "Helen is alive. It's her trust. He's also the listed successor co-trustee if Helen becomes incapacitated," Lydia said. "And if Derek has touched anything in that trust, Graham is eventually going to find out, one way or another. I would rather he hear it from a source with evidence than from his brother with a rehearsed story." That was exactly what I would have said to a client. It was also exactly what I did not want to do. Graham Mercer had always made me feel as if he could hear the sentence I wasn't saying. He had none of Derek's easy charm and all of the gravity Derek spent his life trying to counterfeit. He was 10 years older, broad-shouldered, dark-haired then, with a few silver threads at his temples, and so deliberate in the way he moved through the world that even his silences felt articulate. When Derek and I were first married, I used to think Graham seemed older than his age because he never performed youth. He did not flirt with waitresses, brag about golf scores, or call women sweetheart in parking lots. He listened. He watched. He had the unsettling habit of asking one precise question and then waiting long enough for the real answer to surface. He was also Derek's brother, and I was not naive enough to assume blood meant nothing. Lydia read my face correctly. "You don't need to trust him emotionally," she said. "You need to decide whether he is likely to protect his mother's assets if he's given reason to believe they're in danger." "Yes," I said before I could stop myself. That answer surprised me. Not because it was untrue, but because it was immediate. Lydia nodded as if she had expected no other response. "Then call him. Keep it factual. Don't editorialize. Don't discuss the affair unless it becomes necessary. You're not asking him to take your side in a divorce. You're alerting him to a possible trust breach involving his mother." I left her office with a folder under one arm, a list of next steps in my bag, and the strange sensation that I had been pulled onto a road I would now have to walk to the end, whether I wanted to or not. Richmond in late April was bright and damp, all dogwoods and courthouse traffic. Men in suits crossed Franklin carrying coffee. A woman in scrubs sat on a bench outside the federal courthouse talking into her phone with the weary authority of someone managing both a hospital floor and a teenager. The city looked insultingly normal. I sat in my car for 6 minutes before I called Graham. He answered on the third ring. "Evie." No hello, no surprise, just my name, low and even, as if he had already been told there was trouble and was waiting to hear what shape it had taken. "Do you have 10 minutes? I asked. There was a pause. "Yes." I'm not calling about husband, I said. I'm calling about Derek and your mother's trust. Silence. Not confused silence. The kind that means a person has gone perfectly still. Where are you? He asked. In my car outside Lydia Shaw's office. I'm 15 minutes away. Stay there. He did not ask whether I was all right. He did not say what happened. He did not waste either of our time with outrage before facts. That should not have comforted me. It did anyway. Graham arrived in 11 minutes in a charcoal sedan that still smelled faintly new when he opened the passenger door and got in beside me. He had taken off his suit jacket and loosened his tie, but he still looked like the sort of man who could walk into any courtroom in the Commonwealth and make people sit straighter. He glanced once at my face, then at the folder in my lap. What did he do? He asked. I handed him the printouts instead of answering. He read in silence. I watched his eyes move across the pages, the transfer notation, the draft email, the account summary. He did not react outwardly until he reached the subject line on the unsent message to Vanessa. Need this before Graham sees quarterly statement. Then something hard moved through his face and was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, if I hadn't spent the last 15 hours studying people for fracture points. When did you find this? He asked. Last night. Were they together? Yes. He nodded once, as if filing that under tragic but secondary. Has Helen been told? No. Lydia wants the trust administrator alerted first, so there's a record before Derek can spin anything. Good. He set the papers back in order with meticulous care. That's the right move. The relief I felt at those 4 words made me angry with myself. I did not want to need his steadiness. I did not want to sit in a parked car with my husband's brother and feel grateful because one man in the Mercer family still knew how to behave when a woman handed him evidence of betrayal. Graham looked at me then, directly, and for the first time since I'd walked into my bedroom the night before, I felt the full weight of another person understanding the scale of what had happened. I'm sorry, he said. It was not a broad apology. Not the useless kind people offer when they want to be included in your grief. It was exact. He was apologizing for Derek, for the trust, for the fact that my best friend had apparently helped his brother turn my marriage into a side room for theft. Thank you, I said, because there was nothing else to do with a sincere sentence. He folded his hands over the printouts. I have suspected for months that Derek was asking questions he had no legitimate reason to ask. I did not know how much access he'd already gotten. I should have pushed harder. I looked at him. You knew. I knew he was circling my mother's money, he said. I didn't know he'd gotten close enough to touch it. That should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made the last year rearrange itself in my mind. Graham's strange questions at Christmas. The breakfast in February when he had asked if things were stable at home. The one time he'd interrupted Derek mid-sentence at a family dinner to ask, very quietly, why he was so interested in charitable sub-account distribution rules. He had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, you let Lydia do exactly what you hired her to do. I'll call the trust administrator myself after your letter is sent, and I'll tell him I want every transaction from the last 12 months reviewed. Helen will hear it from me, not from Derek, and Derek will not be alone with her paperwork again. There was no bravado in the promise. No heat, just certainty. I nodded. Then, because I had not yet learned how to keep humiliation from leaking into practical conversation, I asked the question I hated myself for asking. Do you think he'll lie to everyone and make me sound unstable? Graham's eyes shifted to mine. Yes, he said. The honesty of it landed harder than comfort would have. And do you think it'll work? No. He said it without hesitation. Why not? Because Derek has always mistaken confidence for credibility. Graham looked down at the papers once more, then back at me. And because you came to a lawyer before you came to a family argument. That tells me everything I need to know. I laughed at that. Just once, a short broken sound that surprised us both. He didn't smile, but something gentled in his expression. When he got out of the car, he paused with one hand on the doorframe and said, Evie. Yes. I'm not going to ask you to be generous to people who are not generous with your life. Then he shut the door and walked back to his sedan, leaving me alone with a folder of evidence, a pending divorce, and the first unmistakable sense that Derek Mercer had finally overreached in a direction even his family could not ignore. By the end of that week, the trust administrator had frozen discretionary changes to Helen's charitable sub-account pending review. Vanessa had been quietly removed from any Mercer-linked file at the bank. Derek had called me 17 times, sent 6 increasingly aggrieved emails, and left one voicemail in which he accused me of trying to destroy his relationship with his mother over a personal mistake. He still thought the affair was the center of the story. By the time I went back to the house on Sunday afternoon to collect clothes, tax returns, and the framed photograph of my parents from the foyer table, I understood something he did not. I was leaving quietly, but I was not leaving empty-handed. The divorce was finalized in February, 31 minutes after the judge called our case. That number has stayed with me because of how indecently small it felt. 14 years of marriage reduced to half an hour in a Henrico courtroom, with beige walls, weak coffee in the hallway, and a judge who never looked at me longer than it took to confirm I understood the settlement terms. Derek did not contest the divorce in the end. He had fought long enough to make it expensive, embarrassing, and exhausting, but not long enough to expose himself to the kind of financial discovery Lydia kept hinting she was willing to pursue if he got theatrical. He agreed to sell the house. He agreed to split the accounts. He agreed to let me keep my grandmother's ring and the dining table my mother had bought us when we married, because, as Lydia dryly observed, men like Derek often part with sentimental things more easily than they part with the illusion that they are still in control. What he did not agree to, what he never admitted, not once, was that the trust issue had been anything more than a misunderstanding. According to Derek, he had merely been helping his mother organize charitable distributions. Vanessa had only been clarifying procedures. The draft email on his laptop was bad wording. The reverse transfer was a temporary clerical error. The fact that those explanations shifted every time he opened his mouth did not seem to bother him. Men who lie professionally tend to think consistency is optional, as long as their voice stays calm. The bank's internal review never became a criminal case. There wasn't enough missing money, Lydia said, and too much of it had been reversed before it settled anywhere irreversible. Vanessa lost her position at the trust office. Derek was quietly removed from any informal involvement with Helen's paperwork. The Mercer Family Trust was restructured, so Graham had oversight on every discretionary distribution. There were meetings, there were signatures, there were phrases like, "out of an abundance of caution." In Virginia, people with money are very good at building elegant language around family disgrace. It should have felt like justice. It didn't. It felt like a first chapter. I moved into a narrow brick townhouse on Floyd Avenue with creaky stairs, a postage stamp patio, and radiators that knocked like old pipes in a New York movie every time the heat came on. It was small enough that silence couldn't hide in it. The bedroom looked out over a row of sycamores. The kitchen had butcher block counters and one window above the sink where morning light hit the faucet hard enough to make the whole room look cleaner than I felt. I bought 2 new towels, a coffee maker, and a basil plant I nearly killed in 6 weeks because grief and overwatering are close cousins. I went back to work. That was the first thing that saved me. Probate law is not glamorous, but it is excellent medicine for self-pity, because somebody is always having a worse week than you are, and they still need the deed filed before 4 o'clock. I drafted petitions. I organized exhibits. I sat across from women whose brothers had forged their names, sons who had emptied dying fathers' accounts, daughters who found out too late that caregiving and inheritance are not the same kind of loyalty. I did not tell clients my husband had cheated on me with my best friend while skimming the edges of his mother's trust. But every time a woman sat across from me with that particular stunned look, the one that says, "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know it was this wrong," I knew exactly how to hand her a legal pad and tell her where to start. For the first year after the divorce, I saw Graham only at family-adjacent obligations and trust-related follow-up meetings I would have preferred not to attend but could not avoid. Helen Mercer asked me to lunch twice. I declined both times the first year and accepted the third invitation only because my mother told me avoiding her forever would turn restraint into theater. Helen chose the Jefferson Hotel tea room, as if we were discussing flower arrangements instead of the fact that her younger son had detonated my marriage and nearly used her charitable fund as kindling. She wore navy wool and pearls. I wore gray. She ordered chicken salad and barely touched it. I was ashamed to ask you here, she said after the waiter left. Then why did you? She folded her napkin once. Because I need to say something to you that my generation often says too late. I waited. I wanted very badly to believe Derek was merely weak, she said. Weakness is easier to forgive than appetite. It was one of the only honest things she ever said to me. I did not forgive her that day, but I respected her for naming the truth without trying to soften it. We finished lunch like two women who had once expected to be family and were now trying to decide what remained after disappointment stripped away the convenient parts. When she hugged me goodbye in the hotel lobby, she smelled like Chanel and old grief. Graham says you bought a houseplant, she said quietly. A basil plant. Is it alive? Barely. For the first time in months, I almost smiled. Graham did not intrude on my life after the divorce. That mattered more than any grand gesture could have. He did not call under the pretense of checking on me. He did not arrive with casseroles or flowers or the dangerous warmth of a man who thinks a wounded woman is easier to impress. He behaved the way decent men behave when they understand that timing can turn kindness into pressure. If we crossed paths at Helen's house or a family meeting, he asked how my mother was, whether work was still impossible in tax season, whether the basil had survived. Once, in line at Stella's on a Saturday morning, he bought my coffee because the card reader was down and I only had my phone. He handed me the cup and said, "You can pay me back by keeping Helen from signing anything my brother puts in front of her." That was Graham. Dry where Derek was glossy, useful where Derek was ornamental. The second year after the divorce, his wife got sick. Claire Mercer had been one of those women who made every room feel more civilized simply by entering it. She illustrated children's books, wore cashmere in winter and linen in summer, and never once asked me a rude question about children, even though by 44 I had heard every variation of, "So was motherhood never in the cards for you?" Claire and Graham had married late by Richmond standards and had their daughter Lucy after years of trying. When Claire was diagnosed with acute leukemia, Lucy was not yet 3. I learned about the diagnosis from my mother, who learned it from Helen, who sounded stunned in the way only mothers of grown men can sound when illness arrives in a house they no longer control. Claire died 9 months later in early spring. I went to the memorial service because not going would have been cruel, and because despite everything that had happened between me and the Mercer family, Claire had once sat beside me at a fundraiser and quietly moved the place card of a man who kept touching my arm every time he laughed. There, she'd murmured after switching seats with me, "That's better." Women remember who notices discomfort without being asked. The chapel in Charlottesville was full of white flowers and people speaking too softly. Graham stood near the front with Lucy in his arms, his face so still it frightened me. Helen sat in the first pew holding a handkerchief in both hands, as if it were an assignment she meant to complete. I had planned to stay only long enough to pay my respects and leave. Instead, after the service, I found myself in the parish hall kneeling beside a little girl in black patent shoes who was trying to peel the wrapper off a granola bar with the fierce concentration of the recently bereaved. "You want help?" I asked. She looked up at me with her mother's dark eyes and nodded once. That was my first real conversation with Lucy Mercer. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. I opened the granola bar. She said, "Thank you." Then she leaned against my knee while she ate, as if children can smell steadiness on a person and are drawn to it before the adults in the room have decided what's appropriate. Graham saw it from across the hall. Our eyes met over Lucy's head. There was exhaustion in his face and gratitude, and something else I refused to name because naming it would have required me to imagine a future I was not ready to imagine. A month later, Helen called and asked if I would sit with Lucy for 2 hours one Saturday while Graham met with Claire's estate attorney and tried to sort through insurance paperwork. "I know it's not your responsibility," she said before I could answer, and I would not ask if I had another option that felt kind. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I understood too well how women become useful to families that once failed them. Then I pictured Lucy in those patent shoes with the granola bar, and I said yes. The first Saturday, Lucy colored at my kitchen table while I made grilled cheese and tomato soup. She was 3.5 then, solemn in the way some children get after loss, prone to watching a room before she trusted it. She called me Miss Evie. She liked the yellow crayons best. She cut the crust off her sandwich and lined it up beside the plate as if saving evidence. When Graham came to pick her up, he stood in my doorway with a diaper bag over one shoulder and legal folders under his arm, and looked more tired than any man should be allowed to look in a suit. "You don't have to do this again," he said. "I know." Lucy took his hand, then looked back at me. "Can I come next Saturday too?" That was how it began. Not with romance, not with a confession, not with any dramatic realization that fate was repairing what life had broken. It began with soup cooling on my stove, a child choosing the yellow crayons, and a widower too exhausted to pretend he wasn't grateful. By autumn, Lucy knew where I kept the juice boxes. By Christmas, she fell asleep on my couch with her head in my lap during a storm while Graham sat across from us pretending to read and failing. By the following spring, she had started calling me my Evie in the possessive way children do when they are quietly staking a claim. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without spectacle or permission, my life began to rebuild itself around a man who never once asked me to perform forgiveness, and a little girl who had no idea she was teaching me how to want a future again. Then one Thursday in late September, 4 years and some change after I walked in on Derek and Vanessa, I got a voicemail from a number I had deleted but never truly forgotten. "Evie, it's Vanessa." I was sitting at my desk at work, redlining an inventory accounting, when I heard her voice. I did not stop breathing. I did not freeze. That surprised me more than the message itself. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," she said, "but I'm in a restitution program now, and part of it means making amends where I can. There's something Derek did that your lawyer never found. Something tied to Helen's trust and another account. I think you need to hear it from me before someone else gets hurt." I listened to the message twice, then I deleted nothing. Because 5 years earlier I had learned that when a person who helped bury the truth calls to say there's more underground, you do not hang up on the grave. You bring a shovel. My cousin Celia's wedding fell on the first Saturday in October, the kind of Virginia autumn day people spend the rest of the year trying to describe badly. The sky over Charlottesville was a clear blue with that hard-edged brightness you only get after the humidity finally gives up. The vineyard sat on a rise outside town, rows of vines fading gold at the edges. The Blue Ridge cut in the distance like folded paper. White chairs had been set up on the lawn for the ceremony. The reception tent glowed from the inside even before sunset, all cream fabric and chandeliers and strings of warm lights that made everyone look slightly more forgiving than they really were. I drove out with Lucy in the back seat and a garment bag hanging from the passenger hook because Graham had been called into an emergency chambers meeting that morning and promised he'd come straight from Richmond as soon as he could. He had kissed Lucy's forehead in my kitchen at 7:30, kissed me too quickly because he was already late, and said, "Don't let Celia feed our child only wedding cake before I get there." Our child. He'd said it casually in the soft, distracted voice of a man searching for his car keys while thinking about a federal docket, but I had carried those 2 words with me all the way down I-64. Lucy was 4 by then, all serious dark eyes and honey-brown curls that refused to stay inside any barrette for longer than 15 minutes. She wore a pale yellow dress with tiny embroidered flowers at the hem and white sandals she insisted were grown-up shoes because they clicked faintly on hardwood floors. She had also decided 3 days before the wedding that she wanted me to wear my hair down because it makes you look like a princess lawyer. I had laughed so hard at that I nearly burned the chicken in the oven. By the time we reached the vineyard, the bridal suite was already humming with women pinning veils, steaming dresses, and asking where the safety pins had gone. Celia pulled me into a one-armed hug the moment I stepped through the door. "You look beautiful," she said, then glanced down at Lucy. "And you, little miss, are going to break hearts by kindergarten." Lucy took that with the solemn dignity of a child accepting a military promotion. Celia was my mother's sister's daughter, 6 years younger than I was, and somehow both more practical and more romantic than anyone should be allowed to become in the same lifetime. She worked in event fundraising for the university, had a laugh you could hear across parking lots, and possessed the unnerving gift of knowing exactly when to be blunt. She waited until Lucy had wandered toward the tray of fruit skewers with one of the bridesmaids before lowering her voice. "There's something you need to know before you go out there." I knew from her face that this was not about centerpieces. "Derek is here," she said, "and Vanessa." For 1 second, the room around us blurred into white satin and perfume and distant violin tuning. "Vanessa," I repeated. Celia nodded. She called me 2 weeks ago, said she needed to make amends with several people, and asked if she could attend quietly because she used to know Noah and me through you and Derek. I told her no at first. Then she called again and said she had information involving Derek and your old trust mess. I didn't know what to do with that, so I told her she could come to the reception, only not the ceremony, and only if she stayed away from you unless you agreed otherwise. I stared at her. She also said she wanted 10 minutes with you privately, Celia added. I told her absolutely not unless you initiated it. I let out a slow breath. Thank you. She looks bad, Evie. Not glamorous bad. Life has been eating her bad. That did not move me the way it once might have. It only made the day feel more precariously balanced. And Derek? Celia's mouth tightened. Derek was invited because Noah still sees him occasionally through business contacts, and because Helen asked if leaving him out would create a bigger family scene than including him. I said yes, probably. I'm not proud of that answer. No one knows about me and Graham. He knows enough to keep his mouth shut and act normal. I nodded. Only a small circle knew the full shape of my life by then. My mother knew. Celia knew. Helen knew. A few close friends knew. Graham and I had been engaged for 3 months, but we had chosen not to make a broad announcement yet because Lucy was still settling into the language of us. She had begun calling me mommy in private about 6 weeks earlier, after a nightmare, and we had let the name come when it came rather than turning it into a ceremony. Children do not need adults to make speeches about love before they know where home is. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows, October wind, and Lucy whispering questions in my ear about whether flower girls got paid. I stood in the second row with her hand in mine and watched Celia marry a kind man from Lexington who looked at her as if he had been relieved rather than dazzled to find her. I liked that. Dazzle is temporary. Relief can build a life. Derek did not attend the ceremony. Vanessa didn't either. But by the time the reception began and people were filtering into the tent with champagne and shawls and the first trays of hors d'oeuvres, I saw him near the bar. He had chosen a charcoal suit and a tie the color of expensive red wine. His hair was thinner than it had been when we divorced. There were fine lines around his mouth I did not remember putting there. But he still wore himself with the confidence of a man who believed rooms belonged to him if he entered them smiling. He was with a woman I didn't know, late 30s, maybe glossy dark hair, a hand resting too deliberately on his arm. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and I watched the old instinct settle over his face like a stage light. He kissed the woman's cheek, said something to her, and started across the tent. My mother, seated beside me at table 9, set down her champagne and muttered, "If he embarrasses himself at Celia's wedding, I'm too old to stop myself from helping." "Please don't get arrested in silk," I said under my breath. She sniffed. "No promises." Derek reached our table with the smooth ease of a man approaching a former audience, not a former wife. Up close, I could smell his cologne and the whiskey he had likely started on before the first dance. He glanced at my mother, who looked back at him with all the warmth of a tax audit, then fixed his attention on me. "Evie." His smile widened. "You look well." There was a time that pause before well would have cut me. That night it only bored me. "Derek." He slid one hand into his pocket, adopting the casual posture he used whenever he wanted to imply that I was the one carrying old emotional freight. "I've been meaning to say hello all evening, but I didn't want to intrude." "You are intruding now." That should have warned him off. Instead, it sharpened him. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with my family," he said lightly. My mother made a small disgusted sound and reached for her water glass. "I'm here for Celia," I said. "Of course." His gaze flicked across the tent, then back to me. "Still, life's funny, isn't it? 5 years ago, I thought leaving you would be a disaster. Turns out it was the best decision I ever made." There it was. The line. Delivered softly enough that only our table and the one beside it could hear, but clearly enough to land. It was classic Derek cruelty, calibrated for witnesses. My mother turned toward him so sharply her chair legs scraped the floor. I touched her wrist under the table before she could stand. I looked at Derek and saw all at once the entire old machinery of him, the need to win rooms, the inability to leave a woman merely wounded when he could try to humiliate her publicly, the childish conviction that if he struck first, he controlled the story. I opened my mouth to tell him to leave. I never got the chance. Mommy. Lucy came flying out from the children's activity corner at the edge of the dance floor, yellow skirt bouncing around her knees, curls half fallen from their ribbons. She threw herself against me so hard my chair shifted, wrapped both arms around my waist, and pressed her cheek to my side. I love you, she announced at full volume, because children do not understand strategic timing and thank God for that. Miss June gave me 2 cookies and I only ate one because I'm saving the other for Daddy. The silence around us was immediate and absolute. Derek's face changed first. Not much, just enough. His eyes dropped to Lucy, then lifted to me, then back to Lucy again, with the kind of dawning horror that only comes when a man's vanity collides with arithmetic he did not expect to do in public. He knew Lucy was too old to be his. He knew I had never had children with him. He also knew the child in front of him had just called me mommy in a room full of Mercers. Evie, he said. And for the first time all evening, there was no performance in his voice. Who is this? Lucy, unaware she was detonating a landmine, reached into the pocket of my dress and retrieved the folded cocktail napkin she had hidden there earlier. This is for Daddy, she said importantly. The tent flap opened behind me. I heard the step before I turned. The quiet, measured stride I had come to know over hospital hallways, courthouse corridors, and my own kitchen at 7 o'clock in the morning when he crossed to pour coffee before Lucy woke up. Graham walked into the tent in a dark suit with his tie loosened and his jacket unbuttoned, the October dusk at his back. He looked tired in the way only good men with too much on their shoulders ever look tired, contained, upright, carrying it anyway. His gaze found Lucy first, then me, then Derek. Lucy twisted in my arms and squealed. Daddy. Graham crossed the floor, bent, and scooped her up with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. She planted the cocktail napkin on his shoulder like a medal. He kissed her hair, then looked at me with that small, private softness I had once thought belonged only to fairy tales and widowers who survived them. You made it through cocktail hour, he said. Barely, I said. His hand settled at the back of my chair. The ring on my left hand caught the light. Derek saw it. He saw the ring, the child, the way Lucy reached for me, even while balanced on Graham's hip, the way Graham's body had angled toward mine without thought, as if that space beside him already belonged to me. He saw in one merciless instant that the woman he had tried to humiliate at his former in-law's wedding was not alone, not broken, and not standing at the edge of his family anymore. She was inside it. What the hell is this? He said. No one answered him, not immediately. And then, from the far side of the tent, a woman's voice cut through the silence. No, Derek, Vanessa Cole said, the better question is what you did. Vanessa stood near the far edge of the tent in a slate blue dress that had probably been elegant when she bought it, and now hung on her like a compromise. She had lost weight in the sharp, joyless way people do when life has been sanding them down for years. Her hair, once the kind of dark shine women in Richmond salons point to in magazines, was pinned back too tightly. There were shadows under her eyes I recognized not from sympathy but from the mirror of my own worst months. The look of someone who had not been sleeping because conscience and consequences had finally begun sharing a bed. Every head in the tent turned toward her. Derek still had that half-frozen expression of a man trying to decide which disaster to address first. The fact that his childless ex-wife was now standing beside his brother while a 4-year-old called her mommy, or the fact that the woman he once helped destroy her life with had just opened her mouth in public. Vanessa, he said. And there it was again, that instinctive shift into warning, the same tone he used on interns, waiters, and anyone else he thought he could bully with confidence. This isn't the place. Vanessa laughed once softly. It wasn't a pleasant sound. No, she said. It's exactly the place. You've always liked an audience. Lucy's arms tightened around Graham's neck. I touched her back lightly and Graham lowered his voice near her ear. Why don't you take that cookie to Grandma Helen for me? He murmured. Then Miss June can show you the dessert table. Lucy looked from his face to mine, sensing enough tension to know something adult was happening but not enough to understand it. I kissed her temple and nodded. Go on, sweetheart. Graham set her down. She trotted toward Helen, clutching the napkin-wrapped cookie, and I watched until she reached my former mother-in-law's table before I let myself turn back. Vanessa stepped farther into the open space between the tables. The band had stopped mid-transition. Somewhere behind the bar, a bottle knocked softly against glass. The bride and groom had frozen near the sweetheart table, Celia's hand still wrapped around Noah's wrist. Nobody moved to stop Vanessa. Nobody, I think, knew how. "I'm not here to ruin Celia's wedding," Vanessa said, though her voice trembled enough to betray how much effort it cost her to keep speaking. "I'm here because 5 years ago I helped ruin someone else's life, and then I spent those same 5 years helping Derek pretend he was just unlucky instead of dishonest." Derek took one step toward her. Graham moved, without looking dramatic about it, just enough to place himself half a pace forward, a quiet line in the floor between his brother and everyone else. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Stay where you are," he said. Derek stopped. It struck me then that I had never seen the two of them side by side, after all these years, without understanding with perfect clarity why one man built trust and the other only borrowed it. Derek had always mistaken force for authority. Graham had the kind that didn't require volume. Vanessa looked at me once before continuing. I could not read her expression. Regret, yes. Shame, certainly. But there was something else, too, relief, maybe, at finally choosing the pain she could survive over the lie she no longer could. "The affair was real," she said, and several people flinched at hearing it stated so plainly. "It lasted almost 2 years. I told myself it started because Derek understood me and Evie had outgrown me, and I was tired of being the side character in my own life. Those were the stories I used to keep from admitting the truth, which was uglier. Derek wanted access and I wanted to be chosen. That's a dangerous combination." My mother sat perfectly still beside me. Celia had gone pale. Helen Mercer had one hand over Lucy's hair and the other pressed against her own throat. Vanessa swallowed. "I worked in trust administration. I had access to file structures, account notes, and internal routing. I wasn't supposed to share any of it, obviously, and at first I didn't." Then Derek started asking questions about Helen Mercer's charitable sub-account, how distributions were approved, what oversight Graham had, whether temporary reallocations would trigger automatic alerts if they were reversed before the quarterly statement closed. A murmur moved through the tent like wind through dry leaves. Derek found his voice. "This is insane." "No," Vanessa said, looking straight at him. "It was fraud. It just happened in increments small enough that you thought you could outrun the word." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a slim white envelope and a flash drive on a key ring. Her hand shook visibly. "After Evie found us, Derek panicked and reversed the first transfer. That's the one she found on the laptop. But it wasn't the only one. It wasn't even the worst one." Vanessa's eyes shifted to me. "There was another account, linked through a donor-advised fund Helen's husband set up years ago. Derek used information I gave him to move money temporarily through a side account connected to one of his business entities. He told me it was a bridge, that he was going to replace it before anyone saw the statement, that no one would lose anything if I just helped him one more time." My stomach went cold. Lydia had suspected there was more. I had suspected there was more. But suspicion and hearing the shape of it out loud are different things. Out loud it acquired weight. Out loud it became a room full of witnesses. "How much?" Graham asked. Vanessa looked at him. "Enough that if the market had dipped at the wrong time, or one payment had been delayed, Helen would have noticed. Enough that if Derek hadn't gotten lucky twice, it would have become criminal 5 years ago." "Lucky?" Derek snapped. "You were the one with access." Vanessa gave him a look so stripped of affection it almost made him step back. "And there it is," she said quietly. "That's what he always did. He found the hunger in people and fed it just enough to make them useful. Then, the moment anything cracked, he handed them the bill." She turned back to the room. "I'm in a restitution program now, because what I did cost me my job, my license, and almost every relationship I had left. I've been working with an ethics counselor and a forensic accountant. Part of making amends meant pulling every record I still had the legal right to provide through counsel." She lifted the envelope. "This contains copies of emails, internal note logs, and transaction records from the second account Derek used. The flash drive contains the same files, plus a voicemail he left me after Evie filed for divorce telling me to keep the story straight and reminding me that if Helen believed Evie had touched the paperwork first, no one would look too closely at him. For one suspended second, nobody breathed. Then I heard my own voice before I fully felt it. He told Helen I might have touched her trust. Vanessa looked at me and nodded, her face folding with something close to grief. Yes. It was a strange thing, the way that hurt landed. Not louder than the affair. Not even sharper. Just deeper. It slid beneath the old wound and found the place where dignity lives. All those months when Helen's voice had gone cool on the phone. All the invitations that never came. The lunch where she had seemed ashamed but wouldn't say why. Derek had let his own mother suspect me because suspicion was a cheaper shield than honesty. Helen made a sound then, a small wounded inhale, and covered her mouth. He said if she thought you were too close to the paperwork because of your job, Vanessa continued, it would explain why you overreacted. He said people would believe you were embarrassed and vindictive after the affair, and that if I kept quiet the whole thing would settle. Derek's face had gone the color of old paper. You're doing this because you're broke, he said to Vanessa, but the force had gone out of him. You need someone to blame. No, she said. I'm doing it because for 5 years I woke up every morning knowing that the best person in my life had been the one I chose to betray, and the worst man I ever met had convinced me that being loved by him was worth becoming someone I couldn't stand. The tent was silent, except for the low rattle of the canvas in the evening wind. Lydia Shaw stepped out from a table near the back, where, to my astonishment, she had apparently been sitting for most of the reception with a glass of white wine and the patience of a woman who knew exactly when her entrance would matter. Celia, I realized, must have invited her the minute Vanessa called. May I? Lydia asked Vanessa, extending a hand toward the envelope and flash drive. Vanessa gave them over. Lydia opened the envelope, scanned the top page, and looked up at Graham. This is enough to reopen the financial side properly, she said. Whether it becomes civil, criminal, or both depends on what the full records show. But yes, this is real. Derek lunged then, not dramatically, not like a movie villain, but with the ugly reflex of a man watching the last wall collapse. He reached for Vanessa's wrist, fingers clamping around the bones hard enough to make her gasp. Take your hand off her, Graham said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every conversation in the tent had already died. Derek looked at his brother, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw fear land before anger. He let go, but not before leaving red marks on Vanessa's skin. Noah was beside them a second later. Then 2 of the venue staff. Then one of Graham's oldest friends from law school who had apparently been sitting 3 tables over and had the build of a retired linebacker. It took less than 15 seconds for Derek Mercer, who had spent his adult life believing he could talk his way to the center of any room, to find himself being escorted toward the tent flap like a man who had finally discovered there are some stories charm cannot outshout. He twisted once at the entrance and looked back at me. You think this means you won, he said. I stood there in my dark green dress, my hands steady at my sides, and realized with complete clarity that I had no interest in answering the question the way my younger self might have. I didn't need him to know whether I felt victorious. I needed him to understand something far more humiliating. This stopped being about winning the day you decided my life was collateral, I said. The only difference now is that everyone else knows it too. He stared at me. Then Noah touched his elbow. The tent flap opened and Derek was gone. No applause followed. Real life is rarely that tidy. People exhaled. Celia began to cry quietly into Noah's shoulder because it was still her wedding, and there is something especially cruel about family truth choosing your happiest day to become public property. Graham crossed the floor and spoke softly to the band leader, who nodded and guided the musicians toward a slower song, not to erase what had happened, but to give the room somewhere to put its pulse. Vanessa remained where she was, looking suddenly smaller without Derek to perform against. I walked to her before I'd fully decided to. She lifted her chin like she expected me to slap her. I didn't. Why now? I asked. Her eyes filled but did not spill. Because my counselor asked me what the difference was between remorse and self-pity, she said.